next speaker became curious about the strange and wonderful things that birds do ever since his days of bird watching as a youngster. He is currently an ecologist with the Nature Conservation Foundation. Apart from his interests in evolution and animal behavior, he engages with the public, that is, school children and individuals, to better understand and document the natural world around us. For example, in the Season Watch project that he runs, the participants investigate seasonal patterns in leaf flush, flowering, and fruiting trees. There's also another project in partnership with Bird Count India, where they better understand the distribution, seasonality, and abundance of birds. He has extensively delved into the diverse behavior of birds. For example, the breeding behavior of Baya Weavers, the social behavior of Cinereous Tits, and the brood-parasitic behavior of Koels. He likes to think and teach about how we can make better sense of the world using quantitative research. To take us into the world of exploring the wonders of bird behavior, I invite Suhel Quader.
To all of you for being here. I have two apologies to make. One is that I've got a bit of a bad throat, so I can't speak very loudly. So I hope people can hear me. You can't? But there's no mic that I can carry around? No? So as is abundantly clear to all of you, for animals and plants, the two main tasks are to live long and have lots of babies. Yeah? Surely you know this, no? And it makes sense that everything that we see, all living things around here that we see alive today, must have come from ancestors that have lived long and have had lots of babies. Because you come from a long chain, unbroken chain of ancestry, where every one of your ancestors has had children, at least one child. If any one of your direct ancestors had not had a child, you would not be here today. And so clearly those in the past who could not live long enough to have children, or lived long but didn't have children, didn't have therefore descendants, right? And so those characteristics of those individuals who didn't live long or didn't have children would not be passed on to the next generation. They would have no next generation. And so for that reason, one of Darwin's insights, Wallace as well, we tend to find around us animals and plants that are very good at living, staying alive, and having children. And what's interesting is that there is no single way of staying alive and no single way of having children. For example, plants do it very differently. Plants make their food very differently. Animals eat plants, other animals eat other animals, and so on. So what we see as a result today is a wide diversity of ways in which plants and animals make a living. I'll use make a living as a shorthand for live long and have children. And even within birds, just birds, a very small fraction of the diversity of life on Earth, there's a massive diversity of different ways in which birds make a living. Right from finding food, birds eat different things, but even birds that eat the same general thing, insectivores for example, have many different ways of finding insects. Some forage on the ground and grub out things from the ground, others glean from leaves, and these may be leaves on shrubs, others climb up on the bark of trees. You can think of nuthatches, other birds, woodpeckers that get insects from the bark of trees, others fly catch, so they're actually catching flying insects and they perch on branches and fly catch out and come back. And these are not just fly catchers but also things like rongos and so on. So even when birds are eating roughly same kind of food, they can do it in many different ways. So that's just foraging. But there are all kinds of other differences. There's differences in social behavior. Some species are relatively solitary, some species live in large groups. There's differences in how different species escape from predation, which is another key thing. It's not enough to eat well, you also have to escape being eaten yourself. And some species raise the alarm and become very conspicuous and rely on sighting a predator early. Others rely on camouflage and lack of movement. And you can think, I'm sure, of bird examples of each of these. So this is really fascinating. It's something that I can't say that it's the first thing I got interested in, in birds. My birding was rather traditional as a teenager. I started with a group much like BNG Birds in Hyderabad. It's called the Birdwatcher Society of Andhra Pradesh. We went on birding trips and we had indoor meetings and so on. But a couple of books actually opened my eyes to this diversity, and not just the diversity, but ways in which you can try and understand the diversity. And the first book, main book I would say, there's a book by Richard Dawkins, his first book that he wrote, the first book he wrote, which is called The Selfish Gene, and that tries to explore variation in the strategies, as he called them, the tactics, the kinds of things that animals and plants do in relation to evolutionary reasoning. And the basic evolutionary reasoning is what I just talked to you about, that you are descended from a long line of, we are descended from a long line of our ancestors who made a good living by living long and having children, and the same is true for any other creature alive today. But once you start looking at the diversity of behavior that we're talking about today, through that lens, you keep asking new questions. Why does this species behave in this way? Why do other species behave in a different way? Why do jungle babblers and yellow-billed babblers and all the Toroides babblers, why do they live in groups? What's the key thing about that? What's the advantage of that compared with other similar kinds of insectivores that don't live in groups? Why do we see diversity in, for example, breeding systems? We have some species that live in pairs. You have a male and a female, and they might have a territory from which they exclude others, and then they might cooperate in building the nest and cooperate in raising the young, and cooperate in chasing out others from other territories. That's one hand. That's what we call monogamy. Very sort of, hopefully we call that monogamy. And the other extreme, there are polygamous species, where there's one male who tries to attract as many females as possible to his territory, and each female might build a nest, and he mates with them and they raise their offspring. So there's that variation as well. So lots and lots of variation wherever you look, from species to species, and sometimes even from individual to individual within the same species. So I thought what I'd do today is to just explore, rather superficially I suppose, a few projects that I've been involved with, looking at the behavior of birds, looking at what's peculiar about it, what can we find out, can we ask why they behave in this way, and then at the end maybe we can have a discussion about interesting bird behavior that you have seen, or if you're interested yourselves as either college students or just as enthusiasts, if you know how you might be able to explore in a little more detail the wonderful behavior of the birds we see around us. All the species I'm going to be talking about are common species. If you want to study behavior, you should choose a common species. So the first one, I'll tell you about. My first project I'll talk about was my first actual research project, which happened a long time ago. So this is in the winter of 1994-95. And I had read before that about the behavior of various species of tit, so that occupy the entire globe actually, all the way from North America, the northern hemisphere mostly, North America to Eurasia. And one of the models actually of behavior, to study behavior and genetics and evolution in birds, is the great tit. Back in 94-95, the great tit is what we thought was here. It's called Paris major, and we have the great tit all around, and they also occur in Europe, all the way from England, in the west, all the way east to Japan. So a massive range of this species, all across Eurasia and into South and Southeast Asia as well. And as you can imagine, they occur in extremely different kinds of conditions, and especially in the winter time. They're resident birds wherever they are. And in the winter time, think about Scandinavia, think about northern Europe, where there are extremely harsh winters, snow on the ground, food is very scarce, and this is true also for parts of Japan, all the way across the range. And then down in the more tropical parts of Asia, for example South Asia and Southeast Asia, they're wintering in a very different situation. So does that mean there's some differences in behavior and how they manage to survive? What do they do to survive the winter? We knew at that point what they did in Europe, in northern Europe and Japan. They flock in large flocks, sometimes in multi-species flocks that have multiple species of tit. And they tend to eat plant food. They tend to eat seeds of beech trees that are fallen to the ground. And it's thought that the reason that they would form these flocks is because flocks are very good at finding food. Very difficult if you don't know where food is, very difficult as an individual to find food. But in a flock, firstly, one member of the flock is more likely to, by chance, run across food. And then you, as another member, can quickly see what's going on and follow them and grab that food. So, with this vague idea, I just started this project. I knew that there were red tits all over India, and especially I was studying in the foothills of the Himalayas, and I chose a site in the Shivaliks of Himachal Pradesh. So, let me see if this works. No, I have to use this one. Yeah, this is the right one. Yeah. And this is, sorry, it's very bad. This is not a photo. This is from Google Maps. And we're looking north from here. There's a range, a Shivalik range coming out towards us, and down towards you is the plains of Punjab. And so we're just over that ridge, going down again, and then further on is the Gobind Sagar lake, which was formed by the Bhakra Dam. The Bhakra Dam is in Himachal, and Nangal is the project in Punjab, just downstream. And this is on the Satluj river. And so you can see this is although it was a wildlife sanctuary, this was a wildlife sanctuary, you can see that there's a mixture of forest as well as agriculture. And in this mosaic of woodland and agriculture, there was a very high density of great tits. And go to the next, please. So here's a picture. You can see the Gobind Sagar lake in the background, the reservoir, and this is sort of this mosaic I'm talking about. Next. So this is a species, you know it well. They are found here as well, all over the country. And one of the first things I set out to do was to see if I could try and identify individuals. Now, when you study animal behavior, it's the ability to identify individuals of the species you're studying opens up an entirely new world. And you can imagine over here, all of us are people, we're all human. And if that was where I left it, as somebody studying human behavior, then I'd really not be able to understand details unless I could put names. I could identify the same person again and again. I say, oh, she's this person and she does these kinds of things and she behaves in this kind of way, versus he's that kind of person who behaves in that kind of way, as I follow along, as I study behavior. And the same thing is true for animals. In mammals, sometimes you can use natural markings. So as you might know with tigers, people can use the stripe patterns to identify individual tigers, and so you can get a history of what each individual tiger has done if you can get a view or a photo of their side. People have done this with lions and the whisker patterns of lions. So with some zebras, some animals that have very prominent markings that vary from individual to individual, you can actually, it's like a signature and you can identify them. But in most cases, and certainly with birds, this is very, very hard to do. There is some work with swans, mute swans and hooper swans, where the pattern of black and yellow on the beak seems to be diagnostic, seems to be individual specific. And so there we can start naming, that's David and that's Richard and that's Harry and William or whatever else, right? In the UK, this work was originally done. With the majority of birds, we don't have natural markings on the individuals that persist over time. Even if there are plumage markings, the plumage through molt, the plumage gets replaced and we don't know if the marks remain. So the first thing that we often try and do when we're studying behavior is to put an artificial mark on them. And the most popular with birds are things called color bands or color rings. You catch the bird in a mist net, typically, and then you have a plastic colored ring that you put around its leg. In a way, it's like a bangle. It hangs loose, so it doesn't constrict the leg of the bird. And now, because they're colored and because you can give each individual a different color or different color combination, you have their names. Right? Instead of calling them, Radha or Shyam or whatever, you call them yellow-pink or black-white, depending on what color combination you've got. And that allows a whole bunch of things. So what I did over here in Himachal was to catch these birds and to put color bands on them. And the first thing that I wanted to do is to figure out how far they roamed and whether they actually hold territories in the winter. In the summer that they hold territories, when they're breeding, the spring and summer. But in the winter, are they territorial? Do they have exclusive ranges? And do they exclude others from there? Do they live in groups? Do they live in pairs, like they would be found in the breeding season? But I started this work in December of '94, so that's the non-breeding season. And I carried it on till April, which is the beginning of the breeding season. So now a whole new world opened up, because I could tell which individual was which, and I could go around and I could mark on a map wherever I saw an individual of a particular color band. And then I could draw lines joining those points, or joining the outermost of those points, and I could see how they used space. And the first thing that was very obvious is that in the winter, unlike those northern European great tits, these don't flock. They don't form flocks in the winter. Instead, they live in pairs or in very small groups, sometimes trios. And those have home ranges. They are not territories, because they're not aggressive and exclude others, but they have home ranges that overlap a little bit, but not much. So actually there were places where mostly this pair lived and that pair lived and that trio lived. They overlapped little on the edges, but not much. So that's really interesting. That's actually what we predicted for a place that has much milder winters. But why is it predicted? It's predicted because the food should be very different. So in the northern Europe, if you remember, they feed on these beech seeds that fall to the ground. And once you've eaten the beech seeds, they're gone. They don't replenish themselves. But if you are able to eat insect food, insects keep replenishing, and especially in a place with mild winter, like over here, we expect that to be the case. So the other thing that I did was to follow birds around and keep noting at every minute interval, what are they doing? Are they foraging? Are they singing? Are they, if they're feeding, are they feeding on a tree? And what are they feeding? Are they feeding on the ground? And what are they feeding on? And so on. And through that, you can come up with a catalogue of behaviors that they do, and how frequently they carry out different behaviors. And here, I found that instead of foraging on the ground on seeds, they're foraging on trees and largely on insects. So it was a fun time. My first research project was really nice. A whole bunch of other things were interesting over there. To catch them, I found out the best way to catch them is to find out where they roost. Because they roost in holes in trees or in holes in embankments, mud embankments. And if you could find out, you could follow an individual in the evening until he went to bed. Then I could get up really early in the morning before light and put the net outside the roost hole, and they would get caught. Yeah, I should tell you that the birds that I bring, I would see again and again. So there is of course a stress for the bird to catch it and to handle it, but there didn't seem to be any long-term effect. They could stay safe in the same place, they use the same roost and so on. But because I saw them going to bed every day, and the question here to my mind is, when do they go to bed? And how does that change over the season? Because as you know, especially here, we don't get such a difference in day length, from winter to summer. But in the north, this is north of Chandigarh even, there's a substantial difference. Not as much as northern Europe, but still. So I did various little side projects where I would follow these silly birds until they went to bed, and I would get up in the morning and see when they woke up, and I would try and correlate that with the time of sunrise and sunset, and compare that to what is known from northern Europe. I found, by the way, leaving the roosting behavior aside, I found that when they lived in pairs, these are always male-female pairs. Now, the problem was that all the books, including the handbook, Salim Ali's, the Bible of Indian ornithology, and all the other books that I could look at that describe the Indian great tit, said sexes alike. Sexes alike means no difference between the sexes. And this is very strange, because all the books and information about the same species in Europe said, yeah, there's a big difference in males and females, we can tell them apart very clearly. So I decided, I said, okay, let me see if the same difference that you find in Europe also occurs over here. And that difference essentially is the difference in this width of the belly, this stripe. And especially between the legs, sorry, very delicate, but you have to keep looking between the legs of these birds to figure out whether they're male or female. So males, the breastband is broad and touches the legs. And in females, the breastband narrows down rapidly. And even though it might continue between the legs, but it's very narrow at that point. I have another, if you go to the next one again. There's another comparison here where you can see particularly clearly. But no Indian authors or nobody writing about Indian birds said this. So I wasn't really sure whether this feature could be used. Maybe I was being misled, maybe our birds don't show that kind of what's called sexual dimorphism or sexual difference as the birds in Europe. But because I had them color banded, and I classified photos and so on, I classified them earlier in the non-breeding season, and I followed them through the breeding season, I could check whether in fact what I thought was a male was indeed a male or female was a female, and in all cases it turned out to be right. Whenever I saw them mating, it would be what I thought was a male on what I thought was a female. All nest building and all rearing of young was carried out only by those individuals which I had earlier thought was a female, which is known for this species, so the females that build the nest and raise young. So for a young researcher, that is very exciting. I found out that they're actually different, not a big thing of course. But again, having the color bands on them made it, was the only way in which I could confirm that what I had originally thought was a male or female was indeed male or female. So that was a fun time. I was looking at the social behavior of these birds, looking at how they associate with each other in the winter. Oh, I should tell you, there was one trio, and that trio was consisted of one male and two females, and they stayed together for months in the winter until the male disappeared. Another male took his place, and then the second female went off with a third male in the breeding season. So, but all through the winter they were in this trio, and I don't know what that could be. I didn't study them long enough to know whether one of the females was actually a daughter from the previous year or something like that. That I couldn't tell. So moving on from there, I was looking for something else to study, and I knew I wanted to study some Indian bird. I wanted to study behavior. And I used the very sophisticated method of flipping through a field guide and looking at what birds were in India and what I could study about them. Sorry, that was sarcasm. I had already read about weaver birds and Baya Weaver birds particularly, and this is because Salim Ali had done some really pioneering work on the behavior of this species. By the way, Salim Ali, you probably know mostly from his surveys and from the collections he made and the books he wrote that describe different birds and how to identify different birds. But Salim Ali at heart was somebody who cared deeply about the bird in its natural environment, and he cared tremendously about behavior. And I don't know how many of you have read his autobiography. Actually, just as a poll, how many have read Salim Ali's autobiography? Okay, that's super. But that's still less than half the audience. I really encourage you to read The Fall of a Sparrow. It's an accessible account of his life, spanning an amazing amount of number of years, and at a time that's unimaginable for us. But one of his first observations on bird behavior was when he was a little boy, and he describes hunting sparrows, shooting sparrows for the pot, house sparrows. And we leave aside the ethics and all that. But anyway, he as a little boy, he had an air gun and shot house sparrows. And his first published note, others will correct me if I'm wrong, was actually on this observation where he saw a pair of sparrows and he shot the male. And he came the next day and there was another male in its place with that female. And he shot that male. And the next day another male had replaced. And he did this for several days. I can't remember how many days exactly, 5 or 6 days. And he wrote a little note about it. And I think the lesson from that was that there are surplus males around, and they're all desperately looking for a female. So when you remove an existing male that's occupied the space, another male is ready to take his place. I'll come back to what Salim Ali discovered about Baya Weavers, but the reason I was interested in this species is, of course, because they weave these wonderful nests. That's number one. Number two is the weaving is done by males, not by females. So only the male builds a nest. The female has no part in building a nest. In fact, the females seem to not be able to do any weaving whatsoever. So it's only the males who weave the nest. This is the colonial nesters, and you can see that there are nests at different stages. This is a very early, this green part. This green nest here is a very early nest, which you call a helmet nest, which looks like a motorcycle helmet or a bicycle helmet if you think about it. I'll show you another view. Here's a better picture. This is actually not very early. There's a chin strap going across, and there's another helmet nest with a chin strap. And then, of course, when the nest is complete, it looks like this. The brood chambers are closed, and it's got an entrance tube that has varying length. Here's another complete nest. So here's please automatically. So this is a very bad video, but it's a video I took, so I'm fond of it. And you can see how the weaverbird weaves. Grabs a loose strand, pokes it into the fabric, and then pulls it out a little further along, and see how it's making a stitch through the chin strap of this helmet nest. By the way, this was taken, I think, on a this is beyond the digital revolution, no? Before the digital revolution, 98 or 99, with what we had those camcorders called digital 8, high 8, and then digital 8, and then those had to be transferred rather painfully onto some solid media on a laptop or desktop, of course, those days. Next, please. So another little example of a male weaving. So again, it takes a loose strand of fiber, this is grass or palm fiber, and you see he's poking it in, and then he puts his beak in and pulls it out. So he's making a stitch through the fabric of the nest. Next, please. So some others have documented. These are from African weavers. Have documented it's a variety of stitches. I'm sure this is highly incomplete. I didn't look at the details of the weaving, but they have a variety of weave mechanisms and stitches that they use. This weaver is next. This is the entrance tube. The entrance tube is where you can most clearly see the weaving pattern because it's just a single layer. The rest of the nest is much more solid. The walls are much more solid. So this is from an old nest. So I just cut away part of the entrance tube and flattened it. And this is what that fabric looks like. You see, it's fairly complicated. Actually, we go back. So there's been some work back. There's been some work again with African weavers to show that males have to practice a lot before they can perfect this technique of weaving. And they had African weavers in an aviary in Los Angeles, of all places. And the young weavers, as they were growing up, they allowed them to practice with this flexible material, or they didn't. They gave them inflexible material, or they didn't give them any material at all. And so when the young males were not allowed to practice, when they grew into adults, they were able to make very, very bad nests. They're not able to make the lovely fine nests that we normally see. So that kind of work has not been done with Indian or Asian weavers. But still, we can imagine that the ability to build a nest like this, to weave a nest like this, requires quite a lot of skill. Skill that may be partly inherited and skill that's partly acquired through learning. Now, what people have speculated for a long time is that, well, if the males are building the nests and the females are coming to check out these nests, and I'll show you a picture of that, then surely the females must be choosing males based on the quality of the nests that they build. You know? Where we get good architects and builders are chosen by females, and those who aren't good don't get chosen. So this is quite interesting because we know that in birds and mammals in general, females do choose males for different attributes, for size, for color, for ability to fight, and so on. But if this were the case, then it would be one of the few examples where females are choosing males based on a skill, a mechanical skill. And this may have other implications for neural development and evolution and so on. I was very excited about this, flipping through this field guide, and I said I'm going to study Baya Weavers. Next. So this is a female inspecting the helmet nest of this male, very enthusiastic chap. If you've seen them, you know that they have the most hideous song. They screech and whine. You know, I can't imitate it. It's a horrible song, but that doesn't seem to put off the females. Maybe it's a test that the males are subjecting the females to. If you can withstand my horrible song, then it must be the other way around. There must be sweet music to the females. I don't know. And what Sullivan had found way back in the early 1900s, in the 20s or 30s, where he put up a machan over a pond in Alibaug, which is south of Bombay, and he would observe his colony. And he found that males do this very smart thing. They build a nest only halfway, and only if a female approves of the nest and chooses the nest, then does he complete the nest. Okay? It's like you build the scaffolding of your house, But until the female comes around and says, oh, this is fine, I live with you, you don't build the nest. Why? Because it's really expensive. It's very, very costly. It's very difficult to build the nest. The males have to make many, many trips to a source of weaving material, which is, as I said, grass or palm, fronds, fiber. And not only that, they have to defend the nest. Because the neighboring males, now these are not territorial species, they live in a big colony. The neighboring males take any opportunity to try and tear down the nest of their other neighbors. So the mildest thing they'll do is to hop to the neighboring nest and steal some grass and take it over to theirs. Right? But what easier thing to do? You don't fly off 200 meters to the nearest grass field. You just go next door to your neighbor when he's away and steal some fiber. That's the mildest thing. The most severe thing is to tear down the entire nest. You would see rival males tearing the fiber right at the joint at the base of the nest, and then when the owner comes back, they'll get into a big fight. Someone tumble down and smack into the water, and so on. And these are evil little birds. I don't think birds are all cute and sweet and nice. I had a friend still my friend, barely. When I was a teenager, I was really into birding, and she said, I can't ever get into birds. I said, why? They're so frivolous. And I couldn't figure this out. Birds are not frivolous, they're evil. These birds are evil. I know from two pieces of evidence. One is from catching them and holding them in my hand. And the weaver birds know that they can't hurt you by just grabbing on. They're not like a bird of prey or a parakeet with sharp beak. They can't hold on to your finger and squeeze. Nothing will happen. But they know that the right thing to do is to take a little piece of skin, and finches and weavers, they have flexible mandibles. This is how they husk the seeds. So then the bird keeps moving its mandibles like this until it's gouged out a piece of their skin. And I took to this very inelegant solution where I would, and especially here between the fingers, this is very sensitive. I bought some leather gloves, and I cut off the tips, the fingers, because I need my fingers to be able to handle them. And I would, when I were handling these birds, I would wear these leather gloves so that they couldn't bite off pieces of my flesh. So that is one piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence is that I have seen cases where there's a complete nest with a female sitting on her eggs, and a neighboring male comes by and tears that nest down. So the entire nest falls with female eggs and the chicks, if there are, into the water onto the ground. So no, they're maybe cute and nice, but they're evil birds. But nevertheless, we love them. Yeah? So this is what the males do. They hedge their bets. They don't complete the nest until the female approves, and then they complete it. And 80% of the time is what I found in my study. 80% of the time, this helmet nest is not approved of. And then when they are not selected, those nests are not selected, they turn brown. The grass turns brown, and once the grass turns brown, it becomes very brittle, and it's not weavable anymore. And no female will ever choose a brown nest. And so the male tears down his own nest down and will build a replacement in the same place, and will hope for the best. Yeah, the next time. And what happens if she does choose the nest is they mate typically very often on the ring, on this helmet, this chin strap. They mate sometimes close by. And then the mate completes the nest. So he completes the nest by closing this part. This becomes the brood chamber where the eggs are laid. And there's a lip here, there's an edge, so the eggs are down here, and so they don't just fall out. There's this threshold. And then this part gets completed into a long entrance tube of varying lengths. And after that, after the male does that, he barely does anything at all. He doesn't he doesn't incubate, he doesn't help feed the chicks. Instead, what he does, he goes to the next twig next door and starts to build a new nest. And the writers before Salim Ali said, oh, that's so sweet what the male is doing. They called it a cock nest. So it was a nest only for his own use. And they would say that he would sit on this chin strap of that cock nest, serenading his love as she incubates the eggs. If the screech of a weaver can be called a serenade. But now we know that is all wishful thinking. They don't do any such thing. They are building another nest in order to try and attract another female. And if another female does accept the nest, then he will complete the nest and install her over there and go and do another one, another one, another one. as long as the season lasts, and there are still females who are looking for a mate. On the other hand, there are some males who are not successful at all. So that's the basic setup. Next. So what we tend to end up with in a colony is a mixture of, this is a helmet nest, I don't know if you can see this very well. So there's an opening here and here, the male is sitting on the chin strap. This is a nest with the brood chamber closed, the male is sitting on the chin strap. And of course this, the old nest, very old, this is still being used, as you can see by the slightly green fiber. This is the entrance tube of a complete nest. Next. Okay, so how do you study these birds? Again, sorry, photos and everything will be very poor quality. So they love to nest on prosopis or acacia nilotica trees. And this particular tree had an open well down below, actually a pond, open pond down below. And I couldn't figure out how to get to it. You can't climb the tree because they're full of thorns. So this is a high technology. This is a single ladder that's rooted in a sense down here on the ground, and then there are two ropes being tied to the tree, and my body weight is holding the ladder straight or steady. But this is in the monsoon with the strong winds, and you don't want to fall off that ladder into the water. And so I gave that method up for something a little better, which is a standalone one of those A-frame ladders that you can climb up yourself and then access the nest and so on. So luckily, not all weaver colonies are over water. Many of them are actually over dry land. And with a combination of ropes and various jugglery, you can get to these nests. So of course, you have to get to the nest. If you want to know what is inside the nest, you want to know whether the eggs are laid, how many eggs, and I was doing a regular breeding monitoring nest. Next, how do you look inside the nest? The nest is completely sealed, it's only got the entrance tube there. How do you look inside? And after a lot of scratching my head, I hit upon this idea. I don't know where I got this, I need to really rack my brains. But this is an ear scope, an otoscope that the ear doctor looks into your ear with, and it's got a little light so that the doctor can look into your ear. And I thought this is great. So as long as the narrow end is narrow enough that I can delicately push it through the fabric of the side of the nest, then I can look into the brood chamber and see what eggs and chicks are there. Yeah, if they're hatched, and etc. etc. So here's something I downloaded from the internet of 1999, which showed this is an advertisement for the Koels scope. Yeah. Yes. There are dangers, of course, for these birds. Also, a photo I took back then. Sorry about the quality. This is a rat snake. Rat snakes are, but many snakes climb. It's not really rat snakes, so they seem to be major snake predators. So this is a very long rat snake exploring this colony. You can see the nose is there and the tail is somewhere up here. All the birds have left the colony, and the rat snake is exploring this colony, and he did get some of the eggs of some of the nests. But here's where we think that there's a strategy of the weaver that they deliberately build their nest on the tips of twigs, so that it's particularly hard for a snake to get there. Because the snake has to anchor itself securely somewhere, and then not only does it have to reach the nest, but the nest is inaccessible. It has to actually loop down into the entrance tube, because the snake can't push through. It tries to push the nest to just swing. So the snake has to be long enough to loop down, curl over, coil over into the entrance tube and then into the brood chamber. A very difficult task. So you need to be a very long snake, but a very long snake is also very heavy. And in fact, this snake, at the very end of his exploration, actually lost its grip and fell down into the water. And there are other descriptions of snakes falling from very, very high onto solid ground when they're trying to explore and eat the eggs and chicks of weavers. Snakes are not the only cause of nest loss. This is another one. This is called the long-tailed tree mouse, Vandaluria. And these little mice, they're lovely little mice, but I didn't like them much because they would come and basically occupy the nests of weaver birds. They would eat I don't know if they actually ate the eggs or chicks, but they would destroy them, and then they would build their own nest there. And I would see first a mother mouse, and then if I came back a week or two later, there'd be a mother mouse with lots of little pups with little mouselings. So this is a mouse in its habitat in a weaver bird nest, and this is one I caught to try and identify what it was. Next. Another threat to weavers is wind. And so here's we're looking roughly north, and the wind, the southwest monsoon is coming from southwest roughly. And you can see how much they're being blown around in the wind. So this strategy of nesting on the twigs is maybe good against predation, but it might make them vulnerable to the wind. So we just leave that running for a little while. So I want to tell you one thing that I wanted to ask about these birds, which is, do females actually choose the nest, the quality of the nest, to choose between different males? Is it the nest that they care about, the architecture and the quality of the nest? And this, as you can imagine, is a difficult question to ask, because you can try and measure different aspects of the nest, but how do you know which aspect of the nest might be important for females? So I did something slightly unkind to these birds, and I took advantage of the fact that when the nests are at this half-built stage, the females visit. And some nests are visited a lot by females, and some of these helmet nests are not visited much. Those that are visited a lot almost always are completed. And those that are not visited much, very often are not completed. So the number of visits by females are a measure of the popularity of the helmet. Let's call it popularity. So I know that the popular nests are the ones that tend to be completed, and the not popular nests don't tend to be completed. The question is, are nests popular because they are different in some quality, in some way, from the unpopular ones? So to test this, I did an experiment. An experiment is a situation where you go in and you change something about the world. You change something about nature. And so my experiment, the unkind part of my experiment was this, is I cut down these helmet nests. So I first identified a popular and unpopular nest, one that was visited a lot, one that was not visited. I then cut both of them down, and I exchanged them, and I refixed them to their twigs. Now the good thing with that is that after a minute or two of the males being slightly taken aback, they treat those new nests as their own, and they display from them, and they serenade their females and so on. And so that's useful. But the key thing was to ask, now what are the females going to do? The popular nest that was here now is now over here. Are the females going to switch their loyalties or their visits from here to here, which would indicate then there's something about the nest that they are looking at? Or do they keep going to the same place, even though it has a nest that earlier was unpopular, in which case it may be that the location of the nest is really important. It's not really it's in real estate, apparently this is the mantra, right? It's location, location, location. It's not the quality, but it's where the location. So is it the location, or is it the male himself? Because the males stay where they are. The males don't move with their nests. So does that make sense? So this experiment, so I take a nest that is popular, I switch it with one that's unpopular, and I see if the females follow the nest, or if they stay faithful to their male and location. Yeah. So I was expecting, like everybody else, that females must be choosing for good quality nests, so they would follow where the good quality nest is. In fact, that didn't happen. The females kept going to the same place, the same male and the same place, and eventually those males that had popular nests, now I shouldn't call them nests, popular locations, would complete their nest. And the lucky male that had got the popular nest actually didn't turn out to be so lucky after all, because he was as unlucky as before. So from that and from one or two other pieces of evidence, it seems like females actually aren't distinguishing between males or choosing between males based on their skill as architects and builders. And this is a very odd thing. I think the reason is, or maybe we can speculate about that later. I won't say what I think. So that's one little project. Another little project during the same time was about the wind. And I don't know if you've noticed, but now, it may not be so prominent here, I'm not checked in Bangalore, but in places where the monsoon comes from only a single direction, let's say the southwest monsoon, you typically see nests on the opposite side of the tree, on the leeward side. The windward side is the side where the wind comes from, the leeward side is the other side. And the hypothesis is not my notion, but from quite a long time before, next slide please, is that this matters a lot. So nests are prone to lose their eggs if they get swung around too much. But imagine that you're on the leeward side of the tree, first buffered more by the wind. But secondly, how you orient your nest matters. this is the normal orientation. If the wind is coming from here, and your brood chamber is here, entrance tube is over here, your wind is blowing this way, and when the nest swings up, the eggs fall back into the brood chamber, they're not going to fall out. But if you have your nest oriented the wrong way, this is not where on the tree it is, but how it's oriented in rotation, because they have a fixed rotation. If it's oriented this way, with the entrance tube facing the wind, then when the wind blows like this, your eggs are more likely to be lost. And in fact, in 30% of the cases, by the way, only 30% of nests are successful. And of all the nests that is successful at fledging young, of all the nests that are unsuccessful, 30% are unsuccessful because of eggs falling out. And I could check that for those nests that were built above dry ground, because I would go every day and I would check, and I would see the eggs below if they had fallen out. So the theory is that Baya Weavers should firstly construct their nest on the leeward side of trees to protect themselves from wind, and they should rotate their nest, construct it in such a way that they're rotated so that their entrance tube is pointing away from the wind, not towards the wind. But this is just a speculation. So again, I did a little experiment where I took old nests that were not used anymore, and I fixed them myself onto a tree, but I fixed them in 4 different ways. I fixed some nests that were facing the wind, on the wind side of the tree, some nests that were on the leeward side, and in each of those I had some nests where the entrance tube was facing away from the wind, and some nests where the entrance tube was facing towards the wind. And in each of these nests I put little plasticine eggs that I tried to match in shape and size and weight as much as I could to the real weaver eggs. And I left them out there for a few days in the peak of the monsoon and the winds to see what would happen, in which configuration were the eggs the safest. Of course, there are no birds there, there are only eggs in nests, that's it. And I found that the worst, just as you would expect, the worst situation was when you were on the windward side of a tree and with this orientation, all the nests lost their eggs. And in other configurations, a little bit of egg loss happened, but very little compared to this configuration. So this is a confirmation that wind can indeed act as a really important force that might shape the decisions of these birds about where to nest, on what side of the tree, and how to, what architecture, what orientation and rotation to use for their nests. So the next one.
Can you go back to the previous video?
Yeah.
Or the video?
Yeah.
Now we can see how the.
Yeah. So most of the wind is coming from this side. The entrance tubes are here. So
but they're not on the leeward side.
Yes, so in my study area, actually, if you look at, I haven't plotted, I didn't want to show you graphs and all that, but I measured the orientation and the direction of all the nests. So the wind is coming from here. The average direction of where the nests are is not actually northeast. So if the wind is coming from southwest, then exactly opposite is northeast. Instead, actually, they're more rotated southwards. They're more east or southeast. The actual orientation of the nest, and I think I know the reason for that, but that's a bit complicated. We can talk about it later. But you're right, there are nests that are not in this, what we might think of as the best location.
Which is the place you have made your observations here?
Oh, this is ICRISAT. It's just outside Hyderabad. It's an agricultural research institute. So they're a very large, fenced-off area. And when you put nets and so on, and you have these nests that you don't want to be left undisturbed, it's very useful to work in a place where you know you can leave your nets and you can leave your ladder and you can leave your equipment out there. So yeah, it's in ICRISAT near Hyderabad. So I don't know if, I think I might skip this. The third story was about brood parasites, about Koels and broods. 15 minutes. Let me do a very, very quick overview of this, because I would like some time for discussion and so on. Very fascinating behavior of some birds. There are about 100 species of what are called brood parasites. Brood parasites are those that lay their eggs in other birds' nests and don't build their own nests. So 100 bird brood parasites, by which I mean obligate brood parasites. They don't build their own nest at all. They just lay their eggs in other birds' nests. And there are other brood parasites, by the way. There are a few ducks, and I'm sure there must be species in India as well, but not studied, of birds that build their own nest and lay their eggs, but also lay a few extra eggs in other females' nests. So those are not obligate brood parasites, but they still also have this parasitic behavior. And you get to see ridiculous sights like this. This is, of course, a painting from England, where this is a European cuckoo, Eurasian cuckoo, being fed by a dunnock. So this is the host, this is the baby bird, and this is the adult bird. The adult bird is not feeding itself to the baby, it's feeding insect food to the baby. In this case, the brood parasite is much, much bigger than the host. And this is absolutely ridiculous. There are photographs of the host sitting on the shoulder of the massive baby cuckoo and feeding it. It's absurd. Now there are, interestingly, there again, as I said, there's diversity. Even within the brood parasites, there's some more diversity of behavior of the chicks. When the eggs hatch of the cuckoos are a large fraction of the brood parasites, not all of them, and not all cuckoos are brood parasites also. But when the brood parasitic cuckoos hatch, some of the species, the chicks immediately, they're blind and naked, but if they feel anything in the nest with them, they will throw that out. They have a special concave depression in their backs, and in that they lever the existing eggs, those are the eggs of the host, the existing eggs onto their back, and then they'll climb up to the rim of the nest and then chuck that out. And they feel anything remaining there, it will do the same thing until there's nothing in the nest with them. And that's amazing effort that it takes for them to do this, but the advantage is that now you're the only one in the nest, and you can get all the food that the parents bring. And that's about half of the brood parasites. The other half of brood parasites are not as evil as that. They hatch and they behave like good citizens. They're just one out of the many, the number of eggs and chicks. They don't throw their foster siblings out. But what often happens is they grow faster, and so they tend to hog most of the food. And for example, the North American cowbirds, which are also brood parasites, typically the host chicks, several of them starve to death because they don't get enough food, because the parasite chick gets most of the food. But there are these two broad strategies of the young ones. So we tend to get the evictors, the ones that throw everything else out, and the non-evictors. Next. So I was thinking about what brood parasites to study, and the obvious one, pair of species to study, brood parasitism in India, is Asian Koels and their hosts, which are the crows largely. So I went to this landscape. This is Rishi Valley, it's not far from here, in southern Andhra Pradesh. And so here we've got our Koel, the female Koel, and a house crow. In this place at least, and maybe most of India, the house crow is the main host of the Koel. And there are various interesting things to study here. Firstly, we say crows are very smart. If they're so smart, how do they get outsmarted? So people have said, oh, it's because the eggs must be looking very much like, the Koel eggs must look very much like crow eggs. And if you look here, you see the Koel eggs, crow eggs. You and I can tell that. By the way, birds have very, very acute vision. And they can see, most birds can see in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, which means that they can see colors in much, much more detail than we can see. So it seems a bit strange that to call this egg mimicking that. People have said this in literature, that Koel eggs mimic crow eggs. And the chicks are also very different. These are mini hatch chicks. This is a Koel chick and this is a crow chick. You can see big differences in just the skin color. And of course, as they grow older, the differences become larger. So, a number of curious things about these. Given that crows are so smart, how do they get outwitted? And in fact, it's interesting, in Rishi Valley at least 20% of crow eggs, 20% of house crow nests have Koel eggs in them. So it's not just a rare occurrence, it's a very common occurrence. And if they have a Koel egg in them, they're more likely to be 2 or 3 or 4 Koel eggs than 1. So Koels are coming repeatedly, whether the same female or the different females we don't know, but they're coming repeatedly and laying eggs in the crow's nest. Our record, by the way, is 13 Koel eggs. 13 Koel eggs, and there were no crow eggs in that nest. Crows typically lay 3, 4, 5 eggs. I think the most common is 4. This nest had 13. We have another one of 11. So Koels are managing to outwit, in that sense, crows on a number of occasions. Next. So, just back to the blank. So we wanted to, one of the things we wanted to ask was, people have said that the Koel eggs mimic the crow eggs. To our eyes it doesn't look very similar, but that's not we have to ask the crows. You know, yeah, okay, Mr. Crow and Mrs. Crow, do you find this similar, right? And a lot of endeavor we do in animal behavior is to ask animals questions in a way that we can get an answer without them telling us, right? So in humans it's easy. We think it's easy. Humans also can lie. Humans can lie. Animals, since we don't ask them, but we are observing their behavior, it's very difficult for them to lie. So we have to ask them. So the challenge then was, how do we ask them this question? Can you tell the difference between your own egg and a Koel egg? That's the question. No? Can you tell the difference? We have to ask them this question. And so the approach, again, is not new or novel. People have used it before. Is to make eggs. Make artificial eggs of whatever plastic material, whatever material that's reasonably similar to these eggs, paint them in a way that matches crow eggs or matches Koel eggs and so on, and then put them in the nest and see what happens. Okay, so my colleague Sumit did this. So he created a series of, he made molds of different sizes and then made a bunch of artificial eggs which he then painted. So he painted some to look like crow eggs, some to look like Koel eggs. Yeah? And the very crucial thing in an experiment like this is when you put the crow-looking eggs into the nest, the crow must accept those eggs. Because if the crow doesn't like that new egg you've put in, that means something is wrong. Maybe it can smell the paint, maybe the egg doesn't feel right. And if that's the case, the same problem will occur with all the other things, all the other models you made. So if the crows accept this egg, then you can proceed with the rest of the experiment. So luckily they did. They accepted their crow egg, or their own egg, in all but one case. And the second thing to check is, do crows even look at the eggs at all? So if we paint eggs that are completely different, utterly different. We could have chosen psychedelic orange or green or whatever. We thought better just to have these two, solid black, which they should never see in the nest, and very uniform spotting like this, which also they should never see in the nest. Okay? So do our crows paying attention at all? And it turns out when you put these model eggs in their nest, they are paying attention. In most cases, they throw out these eggs that were painted like this and like this. So now the crucial, here's the answer to the question. When you put in an egg that looks like a Koel egg, do they treat it as though it was a crow egg and just leave it there? Or do they treat it as though it was an alien looking egg and throw it out? And depending on what they do, we have the answer. Either crows get fooled by the eggs, and so the Koel eggs mimic sufficiently the crow eggs, or they're not fooled at all. So the answer is that in about 70% of cases, they accept the Koel egg. They leave it there. And in 30%, the remaining 30%, they threw them out. So that means that the Koel eggs are not perfect mimics of the crow egg, but they are pretty good mimics. They don't have the high rejection rate that these very odd-looking eggs have. Yeah. So the literature was actually partially right, even though you and I can tell 100%. You and I can tell the difference between Koel and crow eggs. Crows can't tell the difference 100%. Okay. So crows may be very smart in some aspects of their lives. I'm sure they are. But in other aspects of their lives, they're not so smart, which is unsurprising. We are also very smart in some aspects of our lives. I'm sure there are other aspects of it also. So, I just wanted to show you, sorry, to convince you that Sumit did a really good job. So, these are real crow eggs, these three, and that is the artificial egg that he put in there, which he painted. So, pretty good match. So, it helps to be a really good artist. Sumit's a fabulous artist. Next, I think that's it. It was made of a kind of resin that people use in arts and crafts. I can't remember exactly what it is, but you pour it into a mold, and then he painted it like acrylic paints. No, so it turns out, well, this is a complicated. So we used to think that birds have no sense or very poor sense of smell, and in fact that's why I don't know if I can say, but there's this common belief that if you touch a chick or take it from its nest or something. Now, if it's fallen down, you touch it. Once you touch it, that's it. The parents won't accept. Actually, luckily with birds, that's not true. You can put the chick back in its nest. You should, in fact, you'll find a fallen chick. And that's why so much work on breeding behavior and biology of birds has been possible, is because researchers can actually handle and place them carefully back without the parents abandoning the nest. So we used to think that they have no sense of way except for some vultures and so on. But increasingly now there's evidence that they do have a sense of smell, different species differentially. So I don't know why they don't seem to respond to the paint smell, because if they did respond to the paint smell, then these eggs should have been thrown out all the time, but they were not. Yeah. But any other question I should have said at any time, yeah.
You spoke about the rivalry that birds have.
Yes.
They destroy each other's nests.
Yes.
So why don't they prefer to go separate somewhere? Why do they live in colonies?
Yeah, so that's one major strand of work in animal behavior, is why do some animals like to live in groups and why do some live solitary? Because in groups you can see the cost. One of the costs is competition. In nesting groups there can be that kind of competition, is direct antagonistic competition. But if you're foraging in a group as well, you have to share whatever resources there with everybody else, rather than being by yourself and have all those resources for yourself. So
nesting colonies is also anti-predatory.
right, so we imagine that
Safety in numbers.
there's some counterbalancing benefit. So in nesting, actually in most group living, even in foraging groups, the idea is that there is safety in numbers for a number of reasons. For example, in foraging groups of blackbuck, you have more eyes looking out for danger. Whereas if you are alone, you'll have to spend all your time looking out like this and you won't have time to eat. And in fact, in accordance with that, you find that when animals are in groups, each individual animal spends smaller fraction of its time looking out for danger, the greater fraction of its time feeding, than if it were alone. But that's exactly the kind of question that comes to one's mind, And that's the kind of question that you want to get your teeth into and try and understand. Why is the animal doing it this way rather than that way? And normally we think, in a broad sense, that there are some benefits of doing it this way, but there are also some costs. So how can we find out, how can we think about what are the benefits as well as what are the costs, and where does the balance lie?
Yeah. Just that you showed the view of
Yes.
Is there a social hierarchy for the body?
I don't know for these. I was not able to figure that out. With some of the other, the African weavers have been studied more in detail. I don't recall anything that talks about a social hierarchy. You might expect it, because also part of my work which I didn't discuss. I found that females prefer nests that are higher up in the colony. Those nests tend to also be safer from predation. If that's the case, if females prefer nests higher up that are safer from predation, then you'd expect that the older, stronger, whatever, more competitive males should get those territories. Because they fight for territories. They're small territories. They fight for those territories. But I don't know the answer.
There's two items, one below and there's one on the top.
No, there's no entrance on the top.
Next time, see, not the top, but front facing.
Those are incomplete nests. When they're completed, they have only one entrance, which is the tube, through the tube.
And that's only for a female.
Yeah, the male doesn't go inside. Yeah, the male doesn't go. If the nest gets damaged a little bit, then he'll come and stitch it up. And then you'll see against this brown nest, you'll see some green stitching. But otherwise, the male doesn't do anything. The male is off. Sorry, there's a question.
The popular nests get multiple visits by more than one female. It can be more than one.
Most likely by more than one female. I couldn't color band them, so I didn't know for sure. But from what I could tell, it looked like there were multiple females coming to the same nest here.
So then what determines which female will nest in that?
I don't know the answer to that.
And how do you, okay, but if you're not able to certainly say if it was one or more than one female, then we don't know how many times our female would visit before deciding to settle.
How many times an individual female? No. Only through color banding, which I did do, but these are big colonies and many colonies. I couldn't do enough that I could get the same individual back again and again. Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yes.
There are these multiple story nests.
Yes.
What are those?
Yeah, there was in fact one of the pictures showed a new nest being, maybe go back to that, so if you just, go back. Yeah. Here, this nest is actually being constructed from the entrance tube of the upper nest. So this is an old nest and a new nest being constructed over there. In some places, apparently you get 4, 5, 6 stories.
Is it because of location again?
So, I don't know.
Or is it genetics?
No, it's not
I don't know what
that
that's-
Krishna.
No.
The
Genetics,
previous-
certain populations having the tendency.
So I don't know. In some places you do get multi-storied nests. The thing to remember is that only one is active. No? Only the lower one is active. So it's not really multi-storied in that way. And generally what the male has done, rather than tearing down the old nest and building a new one in its place, he's just added to this. Again, benefit and cost. There's no free lunch. You get a benefit. The benefit is that now for a predator like a snake, it's even harder to get to this nest because the branch is way up. The cost may be that now your fulcrum, your pivot is very high, so in the wind it probably has blown a lot. There's also a lot of drag, no? So the wind probably blows this nest a lot more than the single-story nest. But there were too few in my study area, and other people have only documented, they've not really tried to look in the details of why it might be. So I'm not sure, but this is a very interesting.
But actually, Suhel, I think the tilt will be less.
Yeah,
As it
right.
becomes longer.
So they adjust the tilt, no?
No. When you have a chain,
Swing.
Because you mean it's heavier.
Yes.
It's something to test empirically. I don't know. Actually, one could do that. You could take a bunch of old nests and put them in front of a fan or something, then see. No, I mean, this is actually straightforward physics problem, mechanics problem. It's not a.
Do you ever come across a study wherein the choice of inward direction versus the choice where it is above a water body or
Yeah.
region?
Yes.
Is there a study which where if there is a water body which is in inward direction?
I understand.
How would a
I understand. I don't think I've not seen any formal study of this, but I think you can observe that situation. But it usually happens when the nests are over a well, which is sunken. So the well is already protected, and then the nests are actually below ground level. And then it doesn't matter where they are because they're shielded from the wind. But I don't recall, I don't think I've ever seen an exposed colony, exposed to the wind, being built directly opposite in the presence of a water body. I don't think they simply just don't nest.
just to understand what would they prioritize in terms of
Yeah.
safety?
It's possible that when there are very few nesting trees or nesting locations, when they are constrained, ideally they want a nest over water, away from the wind. And if there simply aren't those kinds of trees in a large span, maybe they might use the suboptimal, but I'm not sure.
So I've seen Munias checking out nests.
Yeah.
So have you noticed?
Yes. So this is common, I think, all through the country. Silver bills, no?
Not silver bill, the
White trump bunia. Yeah, I hate the silver bill. White trump bunia.
No, also trippers.
Yeah, but tripas, I think, I don't know what they do. Well, munias actually nest inside.
I couldn't understand what.
Yeah.
Every example I've seen her taking out. the-
Really? I see. I know munias do. Munias nest inside, and so they at the tail end of the breeding season, they keep checking out these nests, and they're usually old nests, and the weavers don't reuse nests, so they don't bother them. Yeah. So yeah. Okay.
So in case of Koels, do they just lay the eggs additional to the existing ones or do they replace?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In many brood parasites, they lay one egg, they lay their egg, the female does, and then she remove an existing egg. So we couldn't observe this directly with Koels, so we only have some circumstantial evidence. So the circumstantial evidence is that we would check nests every day or every 2 days. Whenever we saw a coil egg that wasn't there before, we almost always saw one egg missing, one co-egg missing. But we don't have direct observation of that.
When you
But-
perform the experiment, did you replace or did you just add?
We added and we took one co-egg and put in another nest. Yeah. We did replace because we we thought that's most likely what females are doing. But we did it with all the 4 kinds of eggs that we placed.
No, when you replace the one into the other, then it was just adding, right?
One into the other nest.
When you replace one of
Yes.
the crow's egg into the other.
Yes.
Right? So you move that from one nest to other.
Yes.
So there also you did you replace or like
No, we
just added it.
Yeah, crows, good clutches of crows are quite variable. So sometimes you get 6-7 eggs in one clutch. So here we just handle it. Yeah. There was a. So there's a question.
I have a question on house crow.
Yeah.
Captain Douglas Weaver, who wrote on Indian bird, common Indian bird book in 1910. He was a British officer in India. He notes one funny kind of a behavior by crows. He says that crows have the capability to count to 3 numbers: 0, 1, and 2. So if they have less than 3, less than 2 eggs in the nest, they wouldn't. If they have more than 2 eggs in the nest, they wouldn't be able to count the different. They wouldn't be able to differentiate between the numbers of the eggs. In any of your experimental setup, did you put artificial eggs in the crow nest where the number of eggs were less than 2 or above 2?
I'll have to go back. Mostly because brood parasites lay their eggs while the crows are laying their eggs, not after the crows have finished their clutch. We would mostly add eggs, those artificial eggs, during that time. There might have been 1 or 2 or 3 eggs. But I'll have to go back and check. I'm not so sure. Just to address this issue of counting, can animals count? Is a very difficult issue to address, because people have done lots of studies like this, and they've been subsequently criticized tremendously because we don't know whether, suppose we can figure out a bird can tell the difference between 1 and 2 eggs. It doesn't mean it's counting. Just visually, there is more egg in that nest. In there 2 rather than 1. So it's not just the numbers, but the quantity also changes. And how to separate the number, in our minds we like to make that distinction, between number and quantity. So all the studies that have to do with counting numbers are confounded with the quantity. There have been a few studies where they've asked whether mice can count, and there they've asked mice to choose which tunnel to go through from an array of tunnels. So they're trained to say, oh, there's food at the end of the 3rd tunnel. So now I have to count 1, 2, 3. That's the tunnel I go. That is not subject to this problem, but it's subject to another problem, of course, which is that spatial problem. That maybe I know in space roughly where to go without actually counting. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question. I'm not sure crows can count. There was a paper 10 years that is titled "Coots Can Count." So American coots apparently can count the number of eggs because American coots get lots of parasitism from other American coots, and sometimes their own clutches can be overwhelmed by eggs from other females, in which case the existing female abandons the nest and goes away. So it seems very important for a female to be able to count so that she knows whether she's been parasitized by other females or not. Yeah.
The counting method used for, when they go to hide and come out.
Yes.
In that case, is that proper counting?
That would be proper counting, yes. That would be proper counting.
I thought crows were tested using that.
So, yeah, I've heard this as well, but I don't know how much it is anecdote versus it's been done repeatedly, and it's consistent pattern. But that'd be very interesting to, if you stumble across it or find it, it'd be interesting to see whether there's a consistent. And this has been said about crows, but other things also, monkeys and so on.
Dogs can count. Dogs can.
Dogs can do everything.
One question which I had was that as with increasing latitude, the clutch size increases.
Yes.
Does the brood parasite inoculation of the nest also increase?
I mean, do you get more brood parasite eggs in the same nest?
Yeah. With increasing latitude or increasing brood size.
I don't know I would suspect no, and the reason for that is this. We talked about 2 kinds of brood parasites. One where the chick that hatches throws everything else out. So if there's already a parasite egg in there, you don't want to put another egg there because your egg is going to fail, right? Because it's going to be thrown out by the existing parasite. So in those 50% of parasites that are evictors, it's counterproductive to put another egg in there. So typically for those species you only find one egg per nest, one parasite egg per nest, regardless of where you are. So most of these have been studied in Europe, but they've also been studied in Australia and so on. You typically find only one parasite egg. For the non-evictors, there are not so many in the north. I don't know, but certainly with Koels you can see that there are lots and lots of eggs, and we are at low latitude here, no? So I don't know latitudinally, but you tend to get this pattern between evictors and non-evictors. Evictors you get only one egg per nest, one parasite egg. Non-evictors you can get more. Yeah. So there was.
What about those that drop their egg?
Most of them probably drop their eggs because they're in a hurry to get away.
But damaging the other eggs. Kilometer.
Yeah, even the European cuckoo, they do that. So the reference here is that the cuckoos, when they parasitize the female, there are various reasons to lay her egg as quickly as possible and leave. For species like Koels, by the way, they are very unusual because Koels are parasitizing a larger host, a host that can actually kill them. Right? This is very, very unusual. Most brood parasites are much larger than their hosts. So for the small brood parasites like Koels, they have to get out of there, otherwise they get killed. So that's the reason to hurry. For even the smaller, the large brood parasites, they have to get out there because they want to leave without making their host suspicious. And people have found this, that when hosts become suspicious, then they are more likely to recognize and remove the egg. So you want to get out of there, and to get out of there as quickly as possible. They typically will not, when you sit in the nest, say, think about reading newspaper, lay an egg, and leave, they'll just dash in and dash out. So which means often they're dropping their egg, and on average, brood parasites have thicker eggshells for their size of the egg than normal eggs. So their eggs tend to be safe, but the host eggs sometimes get damaged. So that's the damage. What was your question about the damage?
So it is not an eviction case, but actually the parent itself deciding to destroy the numbers.
The parasites sometimes are, because she'll either peck an egg or she'll pick up an egg and fly away. Yeah. So the parasite herself would reduce the number of eggs directly, not indirectly just by dropping it. So she does that.
Kilometer only dropped and didn't pick up.
A kilometer does it, you're right. Yeah. So the white cuckoos, they don't, a kilometer generally, the great spotted cuckoo also, they don't, I don't know if they remove an egg, they don't evict. The chicks don't throw out the...
Yeah, but the parent actually kind of reduces the...
By damaging it. There's lots of claims made about the great spotted cuckoo in particular, very wild mafia claims and all that. I'm not sure how to believe that, what to believe. But there's no question that brood parasitism as a phenomenon is just absolutely fascinating. There's the clash between these two species. The host species evolve recognition of the eggs, therefore the parasite has to evolve even more closely mimetic eggs, and there's this arms race as a metaphor like from the Cold War. Amazing natural history over there. Yes, we're done? Okay.
Any more questions?
We'll. Yep. Thank you so much.